Michelle Louise Wyatt was born in the Naval Hospital in Balboa Park on February 9, 1960, to Raymond and Louise Wyatt. She was described as bubbly, outgoing, fun-loving, and enjoyed dancing, scuba diving, running, and anything outdoors. She grew up in San Carlos, California, and graduated from Patrick Henry High School in 1978. At the age of 20, she was a college student and also a cashier at the Safeway in Mission Hills, living at Kerrigan Court. On the night of October 8, 1980, Michelle's boyfriend Patrick was visiting and the couple played 3 games of pool in the garage. On their way out of the garage, she kidded him about her victories as she had won all 3 games. After turning out the garage lights, they went back inside the condo through the sliding glass doors in the dining room and sat down in the living room to watch TV. Patrick doesn't recall whether they had locked the glass doors after their entry, and that question has repeatedly bothered him since. He left her condo around 1 a.m. in the early morning hours of October night, instructing Michelle to lock the door after him as he always did. Less than an hour after he left, a neighbor reported hearing Michelle's 2 collies barking furiously, accompanied by someone yelling, but they didn't investigate or call police. Much later in the day, her roommate would find her body lying on the living room floor. They would find the contents of Michelle's purse strewn about, but it did not appear to be a robbery or burglary, and there were no signs of forced entry. However, they were able to obtain the telephone cord used to kill Michelle. An autopsy conducted by the medical examiner's office found that Michelle's cause of death was strangulation, and the manner of death was determined to be a homicide. Numerous possible suspects were identified and interviewed, but after an exhaustive investigation and all leads followed, the case went cold. Through the years, detectives attempted several ways of identifying potential suspects. In 1996, some 90 potential suspects were contacted and interviewed, with many of them providing DNA samples for examination, but a suspect was not identified. Then in June 2000, more DNA testing revealed there were 2 male DNA profiles collected at the time of the murder. One was from her boyfriend, who had been eliminated as a suspect, and one was from another unknown male. A year later, the unknown male's DNA profile was entered into CODIS, but there was never a match. In September of 2020, authorities began using investigative genetic genealogy, which took 9 months for them to discover who the DNA belonged to. 18 years old at the time, the DNA belonged to John Patrick Hogan, or Pat as he went by. He was born in 1961 in Arizona and moved to Santee sometime in the 70s and went to Santana High School. In 1979, he joined the U.S. Air Force and was stationed in New Mexico and lived in California, Idaho, and Arizona. He died in 2004 at the age of 42 in Phoenix from a drug overdose, exactly 40 years to the day since the murder of Michelle. Investigators say Hogan was living about a mile from the complex at the time of the murder and had friends that lived in the condo that he often visited. Because Hogan is dead, sheriff's detectives tracked down his relatives who provided DNA samples that helped confirm the identification. Michelle's parents are now in their 80s, and although they now know who murdered their daughter 41 years ago, they say it does not bring them closure, mostly because he never faced justice. Her mother says there isn't a weekend that goes by where she doesn't visit her daughter at Mount Hope Cemetery in San Diego. Sadly, she was even mugged once while visiting the gravesite. Even worse, one day both Louise and Raymond pulled up for a visit and found an older couple had been attacked by 3 men with the lady's cane, and they even tried to rape her. Louise no longer feels safe visiting alone, and Raymond always goes with her, and they make sure to take protection. In 1987, 85-year-old Edna Laughman lived in Oxford Township, Pennsylvania, in the 1500 block of Carlisle Pike on Route 94. On August 12, 1987, she attended church and was then dropped off at her home where she lived alone. Sadly, the next day, she was found dead by friends and neighbors in her home, partially nude with her mouth full of pills. There were also pills around her body, and she was holding an orange pill bottle, and the contents of her purse were strewn about. She had also been sexually assaulted. In court documents, state police said the home appeared to have been ransacked and multiple cigarette butts were found, even though she was not a smoker. Police initially arrested Edna's distant relative, Barry Laughman, for the crime. He was 24 years old at the time and suffered from a mental disability and had the mental capacity of a 10-year-old. He gave a false confession to police and was sentenced to life in prison for her rape and murder, despite his blood type not matching the semen found on her body. In the 80s, there was no DNA testing, and sometimes a confession was the only thing needed to convict someone. In 2003, Patriot News journalist Pete Shellum revealed multiple inconsistencies in the murder conviction. He reported that Barry was innocent of the crime and helped authorities track down the missing evidence. Pete had connected the case to 3 troopers that were accused of misconduct that resulted in false evidence and confessions in the past. One of the problems in the case stemmed from the confession obtained by one of the troopers, who at the time claimed Barry knew details of the crime that only the killer would know. He was then released in 2003 after serving 16 years in prison when DNA showed he was not the killer. While DNA was still new technology, another major discrepancy in the case was the disappearance of the DNA taken from Edna's body. Turns out, the judge on the case gave remaining samples to Barry's court-appointed attorneys and left the case open, and Pete found that one of these attorneys sent samples to a Penn State professor in 1994, but failed to follow up when asked for a comparative sample. In 2003, Pete tracked down the DNA to Professor Mark Stoneking, who was teaching in Germany. The professor had preserved the samples in his refrigerator, and it was the testing of those samples that proved Barry was innocent. Fast forward 15 years, and in 2018, DNA from the crime scene was sent to Parabon Nanolabs for genetic analysis. Then genetic genealogy was used to identify the real killer, Christopher Spielman. Spielman had lived next door to Edna in a duplex-style home for 10 years before she was killed. Edna lived on the right side and Spielman on the left side, with separate doors and only a wall that separated them. A Pennsylvania state police trooper talked to Spielman about the killing and asked for a DNA sample. He denied ever knowing Edna despite sharing a duplex with her for 10 years. He also denied knowing that Barry Lofman was arrested for the murder. However, he was a chronic smoker, which would explain the cigarette butts. The trooper said while talking to Spielman, he became visibly shaken and said several times that he was worked up. When police finally collected a DNA sample, they discovered it was a match. Coincidentally, the results from Parabon linked the DNA with 2 likely surnames, Lofman and Spielman. Spielman not only had personal ties to Edna, but also genetic ties, and his mother's maiden name was Lofman. Therefore, he was related to Edna as well as Barry as distant cousins. However, it is unknown if they knew they were related at the time of the murder. Spielman was then charged with criminal homicide, rape, robbery, and burglary. Spielman admitted that he went into her home to rob it, but she ended up being home. That's when he attacked, killed her, and then sexually assaulted her. He was arrested in July of 2021, 34 years after the murder. Reporter Pete Shellum, whose relentless digging into old court records, crime lab reports, and coerced confessions during his 23 years as a reporter led to the release of 5 wrongly convicted prisoners over the years. Sadly, he died of suicide in 2009 at the age of 49. Barry Scheck, co-director of the Innocence Project at Yeshiva University in New York, called him a rare one-man journalism innocence project.